Hi, my name is Rasta Bagheri, and I am an advocate with the CARE Office at UCI. CARE offers free and confidential support to members of the UCI community who have been impacted by power-based personal violence, including sexual assault, dating and domestic violence, family violence, sexual harassment, and stalking. We support people regardless of when they were harmed, regardless of who harmed them, and regardless of whether or not they choose to report. In addition to direct services, CARE also works to end these forms of harm through prevention, education, and transformative action. At CARE, we offer a holistic healing program as part of our support services because we recognize that people access healing in a multitude of ways. One of our offerings through the holistic healing program is our Review Healing Library. The book interview project serves to highlight works that address power-based personal violence, that uplift survivor voices, and that help people access healing through the power of the written word. I'm excited to present our first book interview with Aishah Shahidah Simmons, organizer and editor of the anthology Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. Aishah Shahidah Simmons is an award-winning Black feminist lesbian cultural worker who, for over 25 years, has examined the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and sexual violence. Her creative work, published writings, international lectures, and independent scholarships are informed by her lived experiences as a child sexual abuse survivor, adult rape survivor, and Buddhist practitioner committed to healing, accountability, and compassionate justice. She is the producer, writer, and director of the groundbreaking 2006 released Ford Foundation funded film, No, the Rape Documentary. Aishah's most recent completed work is the 2020 Lambda Literary Award-winning anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. Both No and Love with Accountability break silence around adult and childhood sexual violence, envision non-carceral accountability, and focus healing in diasporic Black communities. Presently, Aishah is one of 19 recipients of the 2020 Soros Justice Fellowship. Her next project will complete her trilogy of Black survivor-centered cultural works that utilize storytelling as a praxis for ending adult rape and childhood sexual violence without relying on the criminal injustice system. She has also begun a 2-year training program to become a mindfulness meditation teacher, which she views as a continuation of her long-term Buddhist practice. Aishah has screened her work, guest lectured, taught, facilitated workshops and dialogues to racially and ethnically diverse audiences at colleges and universities, high schools, conferences, international film festivals, rape crisis centers, battered women's shelters, community centers, juvenile correctional facilities, and government-sponsored events across the North American continent and in several countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. You can follow Aishah on Twitter and Instagram at AfroLez, that's AFROLEZ, and you can view her free videos on her YouTube AfroLez channel. Hi, Aishah. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm really excited to connect with you around your book project and your Love with Accountability larger project. I just wanted to get started. If you could just let me know what inspired you to create this anthology.
On the East Coast, so good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the work. What inspired me to create the Love with Accountability project was my life. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I am almost 52 years old, and this abuse happened when I was 10. So this was in 1979. From the ages of 10 to 12, my grandfather, and he was my step grandfather, but the only paternal grandfather I knew, started molesting me. And I told my parents what happened. And they didn't initially believe me. And then even I think when they started to believe, because they didn't remove me from the situation. So my parents are human rights activists, and now my mother is a scholar activist. She went back to school to get her doctorate, and they've done incredible human rights work, and they're in their late 70s. I share this because my grandparents' home, that's where I stayed. They were, in many ways, there was like 3 co-parents, right? My mom, my dad, and my grandparents. And so if I stopped going to my grandparents' home, who would take care of me? I mean, this is hindsight. This was not 10-year-old Aishah just thinking this. I want to share that because I think that we create these narratives about who the harm doers are, who the bystanders are. And I just want to create a fuller picture of the situation, which does not negate or take away what I suffered and endured for those 2 years. And then afterwards, the trauma that I experienced from engaging and loving and caring for my grandfather. Afterwards, I think when it entered into my 20s, and my grandmother was never told, and I will never know if she knew. My grandmother developed Alzheimer's, and at a time when my grandparents were going to enjoy the retirement years, and they were actually talking about moving to another warmer climate. And so my grandfather then took care of my grandmother around the clock. If it wasn't for him, she would have been in a nursing home. So he then went from, in my mind, being the harm doer to being the hero in the family. And he was a hero in terms of what he did for my grandmother. I mean, it was completely selfless work. It also silenced my reality. So fast forward, she died when I was in my early 30s. Fast forward to 2010, I believe it is, when my grandfather became very ill, and I played a role in saving his life or extending his life from when we found him unconscious. Well, my cousin found him unconscious and getting him to the hospital. My father at that time was living in Europe, and my aunt was living in another state in the country. And so I was the person on right there, battling with doctors, advocating, fighting for my grandfather's life. And then when they came, my aunt and my dad, I was just like, no more. I'm not doing this anymore. I mean, like things really just kind of came to a head. Like we're talking about 79 to 2010. It's a long time to engage, love, care. And I loved Pop Pop. So I want to be really clear. And I enjoyed time with him, but it was so complex. At that same time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is known as SNCC, and a lot of people may know of it, or when we think about the late Congressman John Lewis. Well, my parents were very much involved in SNCC. My parents knew and worked with actually Congressman Lewis at that time in the 60s. I was at the 50th anniversary, and I was there celebrating with my parents, or trying to celebrate like the work that they and so many did to combat apartheid Jim Crow South. And it was there that I think I just started imploding. Like, here we're talking about a grave injustice related to the US's original sin, right? In terms of enslavement, the legacy of that, the genocide of indigenous people. But what we don't also simultaneously talk about is sexual violence. And so then that's when I just really had an implosion. But that wasn't the beginning of Love with Accountability, but I would say that was the seed. I'm a long storyteller, I'm getting to it. So fast forward to 2015 is when I started demanding love with accountability to my parents, because I really had come to and they're divorced. They've been separated since I was 4. So when this abuse was happening, there was a lot of kind of back and forth around custody and all of that between my parents. So, I mean, talking about children just kind of getting lost in adults' madness at the time really played a role. But in 2015, it was just like crystallized. And this plays a deep connection in terms of my own spiritual practice. I identify as a Buddhist, I'm Dharma practitioner, mindfulness practitioner, through meditating, because my parents weren't wanting to deal, because I was like, yes. And at that point, Pop-Up was an ancestor. I was like, what Pop-Up did was wrong, inexcusable. I don't want to say unforgiving, but was horrible. But you all also, what you all did, because you all could have removed me from the situation. I told, this isn't like they just found out. I told, and not just once. And you didn't remove me. And they at that point weren't dealing. And so through meditation, because I just felt like I was going to implode, it just kind of came to me on my meditation cushion, love with accountability, the words love with accountability. And it was, yes, I love you all, but my love is not going to shield or protect you from holding you accountable. That was the foundation. I then was invited to apply for a fellowship from the Just Beginnings Collaborative. Ultimately, I did get this fellowship. We were 10 grantee organizations and 8 fellows who were all working on child sexual abuse. We were predominantly BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Not all, and disabled, deaf, hard of hearing, also white, whom most of us are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And we all each had our own projects that we were working on. And my project was Love with Accountability. What I did with that project was invite, one of the big first things that I did was in the fall of 2016. We got the fellowship in 2016. I had an online forum of writings by about 20 something diasporic Black, cis, trans, straight, and queer childhood sexual abuse survivors. And what the invitation was that to write about their stories about what happened, but then also to write about how we can address this pandemic. How can we do it without relying on the carceral state?
Thank you for sharing that. When it comes to people who do harm, I think one of the things that I always think about is we can hold and really need to hold two separate ideas at the same time, right? Which is that somebody is capable of doing harm or maybe has done harm, but also that they hold a lot of other different identities too at the same time beyond that, the person who did the harm. Your grandfather was somebody who harmed you, but who also had qualities that you admired at the same time, was somebody that you loved at the same time. And then another thing that you brought up made me think about the idea of community care too and community accountability. It wasn't just pop, right? It was also your parents. Right.
Exactly.
So you have community accountability as well and community care too, right? Like the healing has to happen at a larger level as well because it reverberates out to, and a lot of people are involved in the harm in some way or other and are also harmed in some way or other because of it. The idea of community care also as a response.
So, yeah, that's part of the reason why, part of many reasons, let me be very clear, why I don't believe in carceral responses to violence. Just on a logistical level, and let me be clear that my position is more than it's about the ethical and moral, but just on a logistical level, we look at me as an example. There's Pop who caused the harm. And then there are my parents who allowed it to. So if we were to follow through with the carceral state, would we lock up all three? You know what I'm saying? And then if we do that, if we multiply that by every childhood sexual abuse survivor, usually more than one person involved. There's the person who commits the harm, but there's a whole kind of culture surrounding and supporting or silencing, enforcing the silence. So just logistically, we can't lock up everybody. And I don't want to lock up anyone, but we just cannot. If we say there are 3 people in my orbit that I know for a fact, and if we're saying there are over 40 million, we can just do the math. It's just impossible. And even though the US has the largest prison population, it doesn't work, let alone this carceralism in violence. Violence occurs in prisons and there's no rehabilitation. There's nothing. I'm really interested in how can we transform communities. Survivors may not want to restore a connection with their harm doers. I'm not even advocating for that if someone doesn't want that. But my thing is how do we transform and ultimately co-create a world without violence?
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing kind of what was the impetus for, Love with Accountability and what you called it the seed for that. So thank you for sharing that. Do you mind just talking a little bit more about what is the purpose of Love with Accountability? And I recognize that it's not just a book, that it's also a larger project. So if you wanted to speak to the larger project as well.
Yeah, the purpose for the project came out of it is the anthology. It was really to join. I really struggle when we start talking about the first or the only, or as if there isn't a continuum of this work. And so I see myself as a part of a continuum. For me, it's really to create space or add to space for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, specifically those within the African diaspora. But again, available to all, but really focusing on the uniqueness in terms of dealing with the impact of white supremacy, specifically African Americans, unique relationship to this. Everybody has a unique relationship, but just thinking about the African Americans' unique relationship, but then also looking at it in terms of diasporically, in terms of Black, Indigenous folks, Black, Latinx folks. So really creating space for storytelling and for envisioning what we can do to disrupt and ultimately end this pandemic, and do it in a way. I started earlier by saying I'm 51, soon to be 52. I'm really interested in the long-term intergenerational work. So of course I want this to end right now, tomorrow. In the words of Audre Lorde, feminist lesbian poet, it's important that we are deliberate and intentional. And so for me, I see this work, I see this as being in a relay race or passing the baton on. And so one of the things, I had a conversation with a researcher, Black feminist queer friend who's doing work around abolishing patriarchal violence. And we were talking about what does that look like? So if we're saying 1 in 3 or 1 in 6 boys are going to be abused as children, and 1 in 3, I want to envision some metrics where it's like 1 in 50. You know what I mean? So ultimately making it to a point where it's nobody, but what's the work that's entitled that we can reduce it? Thinking about a generation that I probably will not encounter, but that will look back and be like, wow, people did that. And so for me, I see Love with Accountability as a multimedia project looking at that.
Right. All of us hopefully working towards is a world where people don't have to experience these types of harm. Right.
Right.
Yeah. And which,
Exactly.
Does take a cultural shift and, kind of transformation on a really deep level, right? To be able to
right.
And that takes a lot of hard work and a lot of time. And I know in the anthology, just by definition, right, it's like contributions by several different people. How did you choose the narratives that were included in the anthology?
Yeah. It was an invitational call, so it wasn't an open call. And a lot of that was connected to time constraints. I was trying to get this done and out quickly. I reached out to survivor activists who are out about their status because, a lot of people are not out, understandably, and folks who are doing work in various ways. So, there are frontline workers and folks who are working at crisis centers. There are people who are doing feminist or Black feminist organizations who are working in Latinx communities, who are working in prisons, who are working with harm doers. So a lot of it was through people who I knew, but through a network of folks. So that's how. So everyone who was invited to contribute to the online forum on the feministwire.com, everybody was published. Not everyone, unfortunately, was included in the anthology, and that was not my decision. There were 3 pieces that didn't make the final cut, and that was really hard for me. I mean, in terms of just the publishing, I have worked with an incredible publisher, AK Press, who is an independent anarchist publisher that really publishes radical books around just issues that are near and dear to me. So this is not necessarily about them. It was just about like a critique of the publisher. It's just, I jumped from like 26 contributors in the online forum to 40. So it was just about pages and ultimately wanting to make sure that the book was accessible and affordable.
I know you touched on this a bit, but I want to just go ahead and ask again, just to see if there's anything else that you wanted to add. But who did you create this book for?
Well, for me, as with all of my culture work, my immediate audience is the community in which I come from, the Black community in the United States. So that's who I'm making it for. Because of the universality of the atrocity of sexual violence and of silence in all communities, I believe and I know that this work resonates with many, transcending racial, cultural, ethnic, and even national origins boundaries. For me, it's really a conversation in Black communities because so often and understandably, we are in a continuous battle against white supremacy. But we're also in a battle against misogyny, against patriarchy, against homophobia, transphobia, autism, which is discrimination against deaf and hard of hearing people, in support of disability justice. And so a lot of times, especially historically, there's this kind of notion of like, we can't deal with those issues until we deal with racism or white supremacy, eradicating that. And so what my work really offers and really challenges and says that, hey, yes, we want white supremacy and racism to end. And if it ends right now, over half, more than half of our communities are not safe if we're not dealing with these other forms of violence that are happening within. So we have to like deal with the violence that is happening to our communities while we simultaneously deal with the violence happening within our community.
Great. And I am not a Black person, but I know in part of just even looking for titles related to sexual violence in the Black community, or, relationship abuse in the Black community, family violence. I feel like it's so important for you to have this work because it's not something that is easy to come by. It's not that there's nothing, but compared to what's out there at large related to these subjects, there's nothing, or not nothing, but there's relatively few that are specifically by and for people who have been harmed in the Black community, right? And like you were saying, because of historical trauma or just the history that Black people have experienced, the situation is unique.
Right.
We're saying everybody's situation is unique, but it is unique, and people need to take that into account when they're talking about these things. So I think it's so important that you created this anthology in this project.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for saying that.
Right.
It's a lot. And it's hard, even with our talking about sexual violence, and we don't talk about it as much as we should. No one wants to talk about childhood sexual violence. So, or very few. So when we start talking about sexual violence committed against children, we automatically go straight into trafficking. And yes, we need to address trafficking of children. Let me be very clear, without question. But there's a way in which we won't go delve into sexual violence in our families. And I think a lot of that, again, is about, it's easy to talk about the outsider. The outsider is coming in. So the outsider, the white racist, is attacking our community, is murdering us, all of that. Or the outsider, this outsider is trafficking our children. But what happens when the harm doer is pop-up, when the harm doer is auntie, or, what happens? And that's, I think, that gets really complicated and hard. And so people tend to shy away from it. Or it's just kind of like, lock them up. And it's just like, no, we have to think differently if we want this to end.
Absolutely. I know who you said you created the book for, but how might those who support people impacted by sexual violence, particularly Black survivors, utilize this book in their work that they do?
For me, there are 40 different roadmaps around responding to the violence. And I should also say, while I really strive every day to be a prison abolitionist, and I definitely work hard to encourage people to think outside of relying on the carceral state in response to violence, there are three contributors in No who relied on the carceral state and were successful in that their harm doers were convicted. And I thought it was really important to include their stories because A, those are their stories, and B, while I have my position in belief, I want us to be in conversation and dialogue and figuring this out together. One of the women who utilized the criminal justice system is a trans woman who was raped by a police officer. And then it was like a mistaken identity. She was picked up and then jailed, even though she hadn't done anything. And while in jail, and she was a teen at the time she was assaulted, raped. And so her mother, they pressed charges. And apparently this officer was a serial abuser. I share this because it's not very often we hear the horror stories. I mean, that is a horror story, but we also hear the horror stories around the murders of Black trans women, the abuse of trans women, and we don't hear that they use the system and benefit in terms of how the system is used. And I thought it was important to include her story, and as well as with the other two cis women whose pressed charges. And I think so out of 40, these are three, and I thought it was important to include their voices. So that takes me back to your question, is really, I think, study groups and conversations and really looking at each of the chapters and talking about them. And that's why I brought up the three who utilize the criminal justice system or injustice system, because it gives people different viewpoints on how to look at it. And all three of them talk about, even while they talk about how they use the courts and all of that, how they all abhor the criminal justice system because of how it railroads Black and brown people, especially, and poor white folks into prison. So there's this assumption that everybody in jail should be in jail and everybody outside of jail shouldn't be. And there's so many harm doers in our midst who will never see the inside of a jail. And again, I'm not advocating for that. So that we need to begin to think about how we're going to end this pandemic. And I believe that the book offers that. And there are ways to engage and hear the stories, because everybody's sharing their stories, but then they all engage science fiction, speculative fiction. And I'm going to say why I use that language. And it's a term that I learned from the abolitionist and writer Walida Marisha, is because everything, our very existence, is as a result of somebody envisioning that which is not existed. And so in order for us to create a world without violence, we have to envision it. And so that's what I encouraged, invited, actually required to actually participate, was that you have to envision, how can we disrupt and end that? And so that there are a wide range of voices, experiences, identities, talking within the African diaspora, talking about how they believe we can do this.
I love that. Building off that, what does restorative and transformative justice look like to you? And then why do you think it's important to consider this framework in responding to childhood sexual abuse?
I'm glad you asked this question. I want to be really clear that I'm not a restorative justice or a transformative justice expert. So and one thing I do not like is when people portray themselves when it's like, is this your work? So I want to just kind of lift up some names, because I really turn to the work of Mimi Kim, who has an incredible resource that's free called creativeinterventions.org. Miriam Kaba, who has a recent book that just came out, We Do This Till We Are Free, or another transformative justice abolitionist, Sujata Baliga, who is a restorative justice practitioner, child sexual abuse survivor, and Buddhist, because we are Dharma sisters and survivors, and talking about it. So I call on them, or lift their names, I should say, because I learned so much from their work. And so for me, I realize, and I think that this is the thing, this is that stickler, that in order for RJ or TJ to even work, is you need the harm doer to own that they've done it. You can't really transform or restore something when somebody says, I didn't do it. When I think about my personal journey, I'm fortunate. Now, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all. It took a long time that my parents came around to naming and owning their work. So then that created a space for the healing. It looks at communities and harm doers owning what they've done, naming what they've done. And I think that part of the reason that they don't is, I think there's this whole, the backdrop of crime and punishment, right? And so what would it look like? Again, not that they're not held accountable, but if they knew that they would have to do intensive therapy work, restitution work. Like one of the things I talked about in terms of with Bill Cosby, just perfect example, was I said that he really should have been made to hear the voices of his survivors, maybe just enough for him to live on. The rest of his money should have been given to radical, and I want to, because I just, not just the average mass mediated organizations, radical organizations that are doing transformative anti-carceral work in response to sexual violence. So to me, transformative justice really looks at, like, what is it that the harm doer can do? Because you can't undo the sexual violence. It's impossible. But what can you do, to make amends to the extent that the survivor wants the amends, and then also to the survivor, but then to the community, because it's the survivor who's been harmed, and then by extension that community, their family have been harmed. And so what does that look like? And I think that these are some of the questions that are posed in the anthology. And there's a chapter by Farah Tanis, who is the co-founder and executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, which is a transnational Black feminist organization, where she poses a series of questions, encourages us asking the harm doers. And one question that always sticks out for me is not, why did you rape, but what could have happened to prevent you from raping? So that in terms of, like, what were the circumstances that led to that, like really thinking about that. But this weekend I watched the documentary on the incredible singer Tina Turner. Now, she's not a childhood, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know, she hasn't come out as a childhood sexual abuse survivor, but she definitely, we know that she was battered and raped repeatedly by her ex-husband, Ike Turner. And I was thinking about that documentary and just really thinking about what she endured. And there was a testimony by one of her sons and the impact of it had on their son, that it had on him. But just, I also, for the first time, and not at the expense of Tina by any stretch of imagination, I remember thinking, what happened to Ike Turner? Like, what happened to him that he would just commit such heinous crimes against his wife, against his children, and probably others that we don't even know about, right? And for me, I'm clear that my work is, I'm committed to working with survivors. I don't feel like my strength is working with the harm doers, but there are people who feel called to do that. And that's, for me, what I feel like transformative justice is a part of. It's really working with these people, not condoning, again, holding them accountable, keeping the survivors separate. They shouldn't have to deal with them, and if they don't want to, but just to really know what is going on. And chances are they've been abused, which doesn't excuse or mean that it's okay, because I've been abused. I'm not raping or abusing other people and sexually abusing folks. So it's not an excuse, but just to really begin to see the humanity and to recognize that we all cause harm. As I said, I haven't sexually violated anyone, but I've caused harm. And I've caused harm in terms of how my PTSD comes out, in terms of speaking harshly, bouts of rage. And so I think that when we recognize that harm is on a wide spectrum, from maybe as like, like some gossiping, which is like could be viewed as minute harm, to murder or rape, which I would offer is a form of physical murder, but without physically dying. That when we recognize that, then I think that we can move from good, bad. Yes, it's like these people have committed heinous acts, but does that mean that they are heinous? And I think that for me, transformative justice and restorative justice create space for us to interrogate and talk about it. Safe space, I should say.
Yeah, thank you for that. For me, I like to kind of hold on to the truth that I feel, where I think that people are capable of changing if they want to, right? I mean, it's like they have to want to. There has to be resources, and and I don't just mean like money resources, but really like cultural, social, resources, but that it's possible, right? Whether or not somebody will change is, I'm not going to be able to predict that, right? But, I look at things kind of similarly to you in terms of we have all harmed somebody at some point. It might not have been as egregious as, a sexual violence or, something of that nature, but have all done harm to people at some point, intentionally or unintentionally, right?
Right.
One of the submissions in the book where, and I might get it wrong, like the exact wording, but I remember the contributor said, do either of us need to be defined by the worst thing that you ever did? And that really stuck with me, right? It got through me out. That's kind of like the crux of that. Do either of us? Because that also, the person who's harmed then has to carry this also, right? So, like this idea, why do either of us have to be defined by the worst thing that you ever did? Which I thought was really powerful.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, and this is what happens, that people go, well, I'm not that bad. And I think, again, it's just, there's so much punishment. There's Key Alexander, who is a transformative justice practitioner, facilitator, contributed, and he writes about this in the Anthology around just like, there's so much punishment centered around it. And what would it look like if we understood that accountability was really transforming people's behavior, and also, getting restitution for survivors. So, and I think that what happens, because this happens a lot, as I talk about, like, oh, we need to defund the police, or, abolish prison. It's like, well, what about the rapists? Like, that's the first question. What about the rapists? Are you going to let them go? And it's just kind of like, well, let's not act like the rapists aren't out in the street and that they aren't among us, as we see with the high profile cases. Look how long it was in terms of Harvey Weinstein, Cosby, R. Kelly, or that they were held accountable in terms of a court of law. I don't think Ike Turner was ever held accountable for the harm that he committed against Tina Turner. So this notion, like, we need prisons and police because it's going to make us safe, or as I shared around the contributor in Love with Accountability, who was raped by a police officer. We act as if police officers don't rape, as if correctional personnel in prison, that they don't rape. I mean, there's like most prisoners, incarcerated people, like 46%. I mean, it's just high rate of sexual violence. So just as prisons are not making us safe. And we know in terms of policing, particularly in communities of color, doesn't necessarily make, for most of us, doesn't make us safe. The problem is that this is what we're taught, right? You get harmed. And I've been robbed at point blank range 30 years ago, and I called the police in 1990. So I understand it. It's like you've been harmed, somebody breaks in, all that. You call the police. That's what we're taught. But, so often police officers are not even trained on how to respond in many departments. I mean, there are, SVU units, but they're not really, it's about the good guy, the bad guy. It's not the complexities. Because I think about my grandfather, what he did was horrific to me. So I want to be clear. And then what he also did was incredible, taking care of his wife around the clock for 10 years. I mean, he could have left. He could have been like, that's it. He could have put his wife in a nursing home, and he didn't. So how do we hold all of that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance. And I think, now I feel like we're in a world now where we are striving to view things on spectrums, right? Like less of just, it's either or, right? Or like a binary, like good, bad, And I think this is one of those things where we can also work on trying to view it on a spectrum.
Yeah, it just requires like a whole culture consciousness shift, because we're not trained to think that way, as a society. It's like you heard somebody's, committed a certain form of harm. They need to pay for what they've done.
Let's have our last question here. If someone is watching this who has experienced, the harm of childhood sexual abuse, is there anything you would want to share with them or want them to know?
Yeah. I believe that childhood sexual abuse is foundational to all forms of sexual violence. I believe that, what happens to us as children stays with us for the rest of our lives. And so to really always remember that healing is a lifelong process and journey. It is not a destination. It is never too late to receive or solicit or seek support. And if you are working with a therapist, talking to a friend or whatever, and they in any way try to blame you, imply that it's your fault, get another one. If you're not ready to think about your harmdoer or their interests, I don't want to say his, because it's his or her, and survivors are all genders. I think it's really important that you center yourself and focus on your healing. Because I think it's really hard to start thinking about other people's well-being, particularly with somebody who caused the harm, while you still are healing. But I really think it's important, to the extent that one is able to find groups of other survivors. I mean, for me, my whole healing, I don't know where I would be without the community of survivors that I've come of age with over the past 27 years. Since doing this work, I started in 94. I worked with the same therapist for a long time, like 28 years. For me, without my spiritual practice, which is meditation, whatever one spiritual practice is, or no spiritual practice if you're non, atheist, whatever, some kind of ritual with the earth or something that's really critical. I would invite, I have on the lovewithaccountability.com website, there are a list of predominantly BIPOC, and again, that's Black, Indigenous people, colored led organizations, all of which are hyperlinked, that support from across this country. So the United States, that's really important for me to have those resources, as well as there's another page of books and media that I suggest, and it's not none of these are exhaustive lists, but it is a start. Those are things that I just really encourage survivors to think about, that if you've had a flashback or feeling something, chances are that it happened, and don't get caught up in statutory limits and all of that. Just get the help that you need. It is never too late. If you're 80 and you remember something that happened at 10, if you're 20 and you remember something that happened at 15, it's never too late. Something that happened when I was 10, from 10 to 12, that legacy is still it's with me. It haunts me. I second guess myself all of the time, because I told what was going on, And I was initially said, "Are you sure? Are you sure it wasn't a dream? Are you sure that this really happened?" So that happened at 10. And so I'm 51, still second guessing, still looking for external validation of that which I know I experienced and to be true. So just to give that example, and this is with therapy, this is with meditation, this was with almost 30 years of working on disrupting and ending sexual violence, first with my film, Know the Rape documentary, and now with the anthology. I've been doing it a long time and I'm still dealing with the residuals of the trauma. So be patient, kind, loving, and compassionate. Treat yourself that you would want someone to treat your best friend. Like give yourself that love and support and nurturing. And if you go and it's not being reciprocated or given, then keep looking.
Beautiful. Thank you. Aishah, if anybody wanted to learn more about your projects or learn more about your Connect, how might they be able to do that?
Yeah, well, I invite everyone to visit my websites. The first one is No, and that's NO, therapedocumentary.org, which is about my film that precedes the anthology, Love with Accountability. And that website is lovewithaccountability.com. And on both those websites, there's a contact page. So fill out that information. Someone will get in touch with you and then will forward the email to me. I'm also on social media. So at AfroLez on Twitter and Instagram. So that's AFROLEZ. Love with Accountability. There's an Instagram page on Love with Accountability and a Facebook Love with Accountability page. And then you can also find me on Facebook at Aishah Shahidah Simmons, cultural worker on Facebook. So those are all the kinds of ways. And through them, there's direct messaging, there's all of that there's contact, but that's where I share information about my events on the websites and on social media. So that's how you can connect with me and stay abreast of the work. I'm now working on my third, it's a trilogy. So it started with Know the Rape documentary and now Love with Accountability. And the third project of using storytelling to disrupt and end sexual violence without relying on the carceral state. And this time I'm looking inward because both with No and Love with Accountability, it was the voices of many, a combination of about 80 voices. And this time I'm really looking at the trajectory of my life through my parents in terms of their activism and human rights work. And my mother's also a survivor. So really looking at this intergenerational trauma and human rights work and anti-carceralism work and healing and accountability around sexual violence.
Thank you for that. And I look forward to learning about your new project. And I don't know if it's going to be written, but if it's written, I look forward to reading it or just interacting with it some way. So Thank you so much for taking the time with me today to talk about your important book and your work that you do. I really appreciate it. Thank you for making yourself available to students, faculty, and staff at UCI. Thank you for joining us for our first book interview. Members of the UCI community who have had a direct experience as a survivor of power-based personal violence and would like to access today's book through CARE, or who would otherwise like to connect with our office can reach us at 949-824-7273 or via email at care@uci.edu. You can also connect with us via social media on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and Medium at UCI Care. Thanks again, and we look forward to having you join us for more book interviews in the future.